Very nice parks, just for our use. They're maintaining it at their expense, labor, and we're enjoying it.
In the winter of 1974-75, I was very sick with very poor digestion and tried to cure myself with fasting and in a diet with no milk or grains. Well, the diet didn't work, and I lost a lot of weight. Srila Prabhupada visited LA that winter, and when he saw me, he said, "What has happened to you?" I explained my problem, and he said I should just take a little prasad. Then he added it could be selective, but just take a little prasadam. I tried to follow Srila Prabhupada's instructions as best I could and started eating grains and milk and rapidly gained my weight back. On this Denver morning walk, the subject of diets came up, and the devotees were critical of the dieting because that had become somewhat of a fad. When Prabhupada heard the comments, he said, yes, we should all eat prasadam. Let what may happen, happen. Simply, we should all eat prasad. Then Tamal Krishna Goswami said, yes, that's the best thing, Prabhupada. Let us die eating prasadam. And Prabhupada laughed and he said, that is devotee. Let us die eating prasad. So I thought I would add my opinion. And so I said, Srila Prabhupada, I'm a good example that these diets are not good. I can testify. When Srila Prabhupada heard my comment, he stopped and turned and looked at me and he said, the diets are not good, or you are not good. At that moment, my mind went completely blank. I just couldn't say anything. It was really something to think about because, it's not the diet. I mean, the diet is just something that somebody has an idea that this may be good and they embrace that idea. Looking back on it, it was extraordinary how with just a few words, Srila Prabhupada exposed my foolishness.
I remember distinctly Prabhupada was talking about the potency of prasadam. And he said that prasadam is so potent that any animal that eats prasadam jumps over all species of life and takes next birth as a human. And then also one godbrother, Padmanabha, was selling incense or jewelry at that time, and he would always drive. That was his Sankirtan. He wouldn't do books, but he would drive. And because of that, he couldn't eat, heavy prasadam in the morning. So that was like a bone of contention because at that time, we'd overload everybody with khichdi and just a huge breakfast prasadam. And generally, when you eat a whole bunch and you start driving, you tend to fall asleep at the wheel. So that was his concern. So he asked Prabhupada about eating other things besides those things that are offered to the deities. And Prabhupada, of course, was very practical in saying that you don't have to eat everything that Krishna eats. Krishna eats very opulently, but you can eat simply fruit, and not that you're forced to eat the opulent things. If it doesn't suit your body and your service well, then you eat simply. So there was a gap in the conversation between the devotees and Prabhupada, at which point I decided I was going to jump in with a question that had been on my mind. I had distributed books for a long time, and I would constantly be bombarded by people's statements. So why don't you get a job? Stop harassing me, why are you asking for donations? And so many comments that would affect my mind and my faith. So I asked Prabhupada, I said, Prabhupada, sometimes we get the comments that, as devotees, that we're trying to escape this material world by living in a temple, asking for donations, and that we're not being responsible human beings and taking up regular 9-to-5 type of jobs. And he responded very kindly in that he didn't blast me for for my lack of faith or lack of understanding of our position as devotees and disciples and followers of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and in the mood of Sankirtan. And Prabhupada, he went on the entire walk from that point on, talking about this very point. He said, does a rich man's son work? We are sons of Krishna, and Krishna is the wealthiest man. A factory owner, he's very wealthy, but does he work? No, he employs others to engage and do his business. Does that mean that he's lazy, that he's not productive because he himself doesn't work? So he was giving some analogies like that. So he was able to dispel my doubts that morning walk about the non-necessity of having to go back and get a 9-to-5 job, that I was actually doing the proper service. And he was just so compassionate. He would look at me and very lovingly, and if I didn't understand one point, he would come up with another analogy so that I would really get the point. And that's the first time I really felt a personal connection with Prabhupada.
And this one morning, I remember he was hammering me on this one point, because I kept on saying that the living entity grows. And Srila Prabhupada was saying, no, not growing, changing, second by second changing. And for some reason, I just could not understand that concept, that the living entity is changing at every second. And like the picture in the book with the different movie frames, I was thinking that the body is growing, because I wasn't looking at it as in a spiritual context at all. But I was so conditioned to this way of looking at things. The child is born and then it grows. And Prabhupada was hammering this point home with me, that no, this concept of growth is wrong. The body is changing. Every second there's a new body and a new body, like that, changing. But he must have hammered it on me for about 10 minutes, you know. And I was so thick, I just could not understand the concept at all. But finally, I began to understand it. But I realized actually on this walk how conditioned I was by my so-called education and, you know, Darwinism and all this other nonsense that you're fed when you're growing up in America. To understand Krishna consciousness, I had to like unlearn a lot of things too before I could even, you know, grasp some of the basics. So it was kind of an awakening for me.
Dharma samasthapak lokanang hitakarna dirbhuvane mannang sarannakaram.
When Prabhupada came into the airport, they had planned for the television and different people to interview him. So they brought him into a room, but then nobody showed up. And I just remember Prabhupada was very undisturbed. You know, we were all upset that it didn't happen. And then they took Prabhupada back to the temple. The Denver temple's very long, and at that time we just had little Radha Krishna. And when they opened the curtain, Prabhupada immediately called Brahmananda over. And he was saying that little Krishna didn't have a peacock feather on. And we were all amazed that from such a great distance, his Vyasasana was way in the back of that temple, that he immediately saw that and had them fix it.
In Denver, it was just after LA, and all of the problems that were there in Los Angeles and the political situations of the organization, of management of the society were weighing heavily upon him. And at the same time, when he was in Denver, there was an undercurrent, not a major theme, but an undercurrent of problems with householders. There were also other problems with some sannyasis. I forgot who it was. And it seemed to be in America, Prabhupada was very much preoccupied with disturbances. Whereas in India, he was preoccupied perhaps with fighting with people who were trying to take away lands. I think he was less disturbed by that than he was by the disturbances with devotees.
I'll never forget Vishnu John putting Radha Damodar into my van. I had a Volkswagen bus. Vishnu John sort of reclined on the little bed type of thing I had there, and the murtis were placed carefully on the seat. And as I drove to the park, he was singing some beautiful song, and I just was in ecstasy. And I just made sure I wasn't driving too fast because I didn't want to see Vishnu John or anything else go flying. But I felt so fortunate. We arrived at the park, and they had a great kirtan group. It was sort of one of the first, what I would call kirtan bands at the time.
Vishnu John Swami would be playing harmonium and singing, and then we would play the various instruments that he had accumulated over the course of time, like the Esraj that you see Sri Ram here playing, the Ektar, which no one in ISKCON at that time was playing, and then we'd have various sorts of drums and percussive instruments that the other brahmacharis would play or guests would play that were usually musicians. That was basically what we did. Prabhupada was extremely pleased because it was a devotee-making program. There are many brahmacharis that came as a result of our traveling, preaching, and presenting the chanting of Hare Krishna and the distribution of BTG magazines and other books. Secondly, it was the way Vishnu John Swami had arranged it. The deities were, of course, were always captivating. The exotic instruments, his deep and melodious voice, and his sheer enthusiasm for chanting the holy name. People literally were captivated upon seeing this whole presentation.
My father drove my wife and I and my daughter, who was an infant at the time, to Chicago to Rath Yatra to see Prabhupada. When we arrived, the devotees were on their way to the airport, and they had not found the car. They had some old, inappropriate car to pick up Prabhupada, which was so fortunate for us because my father happened to have a Cadillac at the time. So that car was taken for picking up Srila Prabhupada. It was very nice. And then he came back to the temple, and my father was given a chance to meet with Srila Prabhupada. So they had a discussion, and my father started with that the Western people were devils. It was sort of a very broad statement. Prabhupada responded, "No, why?" And he said, well, they've dropped the atomic bomb on Japan, and mentioned that when he was in the Pacific in World War II, that some of the sailors used to drop the Japanese prisoners of war off the boat to see them be eaten by sharks for sport. Prabhupada said, no, they attacked you. And my father accepted that. But it was a nice exchange. Prabhupada was very kind and respectful. At the time, my father, I think, he would have been 54 years old, which I thought was extremely old at the time. I'm now 55.
I had gotten a magazine at a concert. John McLaughlin and his Mahavishnu Orchestra and the devotees gave me this magazine. I said, oh, this is Mahavishnu. After coming to the temple for the first Sunday feast, I continued to come. I never missed one Sunday feast. I kept going and started chanting regularly and attending the classes. And on Friday after I got out from work, I would get on the train and try to make it to the temple and stay there all weekend. Devotees would drop me off on Monday at the train station. They would be going on Harinam, and I had to go to work. And finally I said, I don't want to go to this job. I want to stay and chant with the devotees. Finally, after that, I joined. When we were going on the book distribution, I traveled from Chicago to St. Louis to Texas to Oklahoma, Arizona, and all the way up to Los Angeles. And I ended up staying in Los Angeles. But somehow I still wasn't convinced by the devotees' behavior. A couple of things happened that were a little disturbing. So I said, Prabhupada's coming to Chicago, so I'm going to go back to Chicago and meet Prabhupada. And I'll know then for sure whether I'm going to stay in Krishna consciousness or whether I'm going to leave. Took the bus back. It's a very hot 3-day ride on the bus. We were painting the temple and waiting for Prabhupada to come. And finally the day arrived. The devotees were going to the airport. I also wanted to go, but they told me that I couldn't go. I had to keep on cleaning the temple and getting everything ready for Prabhupada to come. When the car was on the way back, they called and says, okay, Prabhupada's on the way. All the devotees should get ready to have kirtan out in the front. So we went outside to wait, and the car pulled up, and Prabhupada was sitting in the back seat. And they opened the door, and Prabhupada got out. And immediately on seeing Prabhupada, just uncontrollable tears just came down my face. And I didn't think I was a crybaby type, but something that was just uncontrollable. I couldn't control it, but then I knew that actually, yes, this is the messenger of God. I was completely convinced from that point that Prabhupada was definitely Krishna's representative. There was no doubt about it. So I said, okay, Krishna, I'm not going anywhere. And I made a vow at that time that actually I would continue to serve Prabhupada regardless, no matter what actually happened, you know, in the long run. Whoever went, whoever stayed, that somehow I would continue serving Prabhupada.
The day before Srila Prabhupada left Chicago, there was a great celebration in the temple. 4 small sets of Sri Sri Gaurnitai deities, brass deities, were installed. And while the devotees chanted the Maha Mantra and read from the Bhagavatam and other scriptures, the deities were given a full abhishek, and then they were dressed, and then each set was carried out to a different bus, a Radha Damodar bus. And each set was to preside over that bus while the devotees preached and sold Prabhupada's books. So when that was complete, Srila Prabhupada gave a talk, and he mentioned how pleased he was that now with these buses, devotees could go from town to town and city to city and distribute books explaining the science of Krishna consciousness. He said, materially, racing around will not help us in spiritual life. We were allowed to be advanced materially, but we should never forget our spiritual duty and our spiritual identity. If we do forget those things, then our human form of life is wasted. So after this talk, then there was an initiation. 75 devotees became initiated at this time. And we could see how Prabhupada was pleased by the devotees' efforts, how Krishna consciousness was being spread successfully. This pleased Prabhupada very much.
Krishna Kirtana Gana Ratana Prabhu Premamritam Banidhi.
I was fortunate to film Srila Prabhupada at the airport arrival in Philadelphia, and I remember how thrilling that was, because when he would walk through the airport and everybody chanting and dancing in ecstasy, it was an experience that's hard to describe how satisfying it is to be in his association in public with so many devotees. I remember the officials from Philadelphia who were nervously dealing with this arrival of this VIP, but they have greeted many VIPs at the Philadelphia airport in their day, but they never greeted a VIP who had such an entourage and with such sound. All the senses were engaged. It looked so great, it sounded great, it smelled great with the garlands. And this police official who was there, who was a high-up official, was a little bewildered at first, but he was steady in his own way because he didn't lose his cool. And As I recall, later on, he was very proud of the festival because he got swept up in the transcendental ecstasy of Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan movement.
All the devotees rushed to the arrival gate to meet Srila Prabhupada. And Ambojaksha, who had never seen Srila Prabhupada, turned to me and said, "What should I do? Where should I go? Tell me what to do." He actually said that to me. "Tell me what I should do." And I said, "Ambojaksha, just go stand by the asana that's been set up for Srila Prabhupada, because you know he's coming there. And you can position yourself right next to Srila Prabhupada." So we agreed, and we both went there. So as Srila Prabhupada came and sat down, a devotee lady approached Ambojaksha with this huge plate of fresh cut fruit for Srila Prabhupada and gave it to Ambojaksha. So Ambojaksha offers the plate to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada takes one fruit, pops it into his mouth, and then does the Bengali drinking style with the water. And for Ambojaksha, it was just perfect.
This is the first time Prabhupada had been to Philadelphia when there was a temple there. Before, he stopped off at Butler. On the way back from Butler to New York, he stopped off at the University of Pennsylvania, October of '65. Then he came to Temple University once, spoke in Swami Nikalananda's course, made some devotees too from another program. Prabhupada also met with scholars while he was in Philadelphia. Tom Hopkins, who he was really, really quite favorable to. And this professor from the Temple University, my religion department, Babhuti Yadav, and Prabhupada raked over the coals. It was so heavy with him. Prabhupada said to him, "What do you teach?" He said, "Hinduism." Prabhupada said, "And what is that Hinduism?" And Professor Yadav made the mistake of saying, "I don't know. You tell me, what is that Hinduism?" Prabhupada said, "Oh, you're teaching. You do not know?" He said, "This is our Swarab Damodar. He's also a PhD. Let us ask his opinion." He says he's teaching, but he says he does not know. What is your judgment? On cue, Swarab Damodar says, "Cheater, Srila Prabhupada, that is called cheater." This is how it starts. Prabhupada says, "So, he's called you a cheater." It got heavier and heavier. Finally, Yadav admitted he was a cheater. He said to Prabhupada, "Yes, I'm a cheater, but I'm an honest cheater." Prabhupada did give him a break. He said, "You say you are honest, but the judgment of a cheater cannot be accepted." So he was demanding that Prabhupada tell him what Hinduism is. And Prabhupada said, "First, you become shaven-headed like these. Then I will teach you. Tadvidi pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya." Babhuti Yadav says, "I did when I came in, I offered my pranams." He folded his hands together. And Prabhupada said, "Then my first instruction to you is stop this cheating business." Oh, and the GBC and everybody were just shooting daggers at me, because Prabhupada was quite visibly angry. And I didn't know what to do. I had brought him and everything. And there were some graduate students there, or friends of mine, who couldn't believe it, what Prabhupada was doing to him. Another point, Prabhupada quoted the verse, "Mamekam sharanam braja." Just